Welcome, everybody, to the Indie Game Lunch Hour. Today we talk with Scott Find about why we continue to play games past finishing the single player campaign.
The Indie Game Lunch Hour.
In our live magical podcast, we give game devs the chance to hear stories of breaking in from industry experts, as well as directly ask them questions about their areas of expertise in the second half of each episode. This is a mostly unedited recording of a weekly event we host here in our Discord on Wednesdays at 12 p.m. Eastern Time, so feel free to swing by and join us for the next one. Ask your own questions live. I'm your host, as always, Willem Delmenthal, the headmaster of the Indie Game Academy and the Wizard of Joy. And joining me today is Scott Fine. Scott is a systems designer at Skydance Interactive, as well as just a cool dude who I've had the chance to just meet for a couple of minutes before we began the episode. I'm excited to dig down and talk about basically gamification and how we keep somebody interested in a campaign. And then also, perhaps, some systems design. Scott, welcome to the show. What are you having for lunch here today?
It's actually still in the morning for me here, so I just scarfed down a breakfast burrito and I'm enjoying a morning coffee.
Nice. That is one of the most common answers we get. I think a lot of people are over in the PT time zone. Was the breakfast burrito like frozen, freshly made? Give me some context here.
Oh no, I Postmated a breakfast burrito. There's this place nearby. Okay, so the breakfast burrito story arc. I went when I moved here. I went hunting for like good breakfast burritos and good boba stores. And I tried a bunch of different breakfast burritos, and I found one that was really, really good. And so every once in a while, I'll just get it delivered, and it's heavenly.
So that's like, is that how you settle into a new location? You're like, all right, let me Google and set up a list of potential breakfast burrito spots, and then you check them off one at a time until you find your one.
Yeah. Just need good coffee, good breakfast, and good boba milk teas, and I'm happy.
That's it. I love that. Amazing. Well, Scott, I'm excited to have you on the show. If nothing else, it's always great to talk to other designers. I openly talk about how this podcast is semi-selfish because I just get to learn from cool people. So thank you for being here and letting us learn from you, Scott. The first thing that we always ask, though, on this show is for your origin story, because it's always valuable and interesting to hear how people got started. So I would love, Scott, to hear your origin story, how you got started in the game industry, and how you got to where you are today.
So my game industry story is interesting because I've gotten into the industry not once but twice.
Okay.
But I'll get to that in a second. So like many people, I started gaming when I was a little kid. My first game was Wolfenstein 3D when I was like 3 or 4 years old. My parents had a PC. Yeah, my parents had a PC and they let me unrestricted play whatever. So I grew up playing shooting Nazis and demons, which probably not the best idea for a 3-year-old kid, but it was fun at the time.
Really formed your personality. Attribute a lot of who you are to that.
Yeah. Over the years, I'd N64, built a PC, played lots of Warcraft 3, Wind Waker, all that. Eventually, I got into college and I needed to make a decision. I was a composition major, actually, initially. Wanted to do music, be a music composer. But I wasn't very good at it. So I came to a crossroads and I was like, okay, I need to probably try something different because I'm not getting accepted into colleges. And so I said, okay, video games sounds fun. Let me try that for a couple of years, see how that goes. So it went pretty well. Went through Full Sail, college, did the whole thing. Met some really great people in college, and one of them in particular, in my final project for college, was already working in the industry at Jumpstart. And so we just happened to end up in the same group. And he just so happened to live like 5 miles away from me. This was like an online college, so it was just sheer dumb luck. He was like, hey, do you want to... Right? Do you want to get a tour of the studio? And I was like, oh, heck yeah, that sounds awesome. And so we got a tour. I talked to the creative director, and that turned into an interview. That turned into an internship. That turned into 13 really fun months at Jumpstart, working on... we had an MMO at the time, School of Dragons, and So I was doing a lot of work on Dragon Racing and some QA work in the early days.
That's
Eventually,
straight up a dream come true. You get to work on Dragon Racing, How to Train Your Dragon type thing. That's so cool.
yeah, it was a hell of a start to my career. But I enjoyed
brain
it.
games. Not as cool.
Yeah, I enjoyed it a lot. We went to after that for a little while. We expanded and they did some NFL games, which we did. I think we did a great job, and they were a lot of fun. But it's difficult to make money when you're making kids games. There's a lot of red tape, COPA restrictions, and obviously you can't use like microtransactions and stuff because it's unethical. So the game didn't do so well in that regard, and they ended up having layoffs, which would result in me leaving the industry because I couldn't find another job for a few months. And I ended up working for the government for a while, which was interesting, but ultimately my heart was still with games. So about 6 months into that job, this is 2 years or about a year and a half after I got laid off, I started my blog because I wasn't making as many games as I was before. And so I needed to try to analyze games and pick them apart and write them down and figure them out. So I started doing that, and one of my old coworkers who had gotten a job elsewhere said, "Hey, you're still doing game stuff?" And I was like, "Yes, please. I would very much so like to." And she mentioned that there was a position opening up at level 5. And so she said, "Do you want to take a shot for this?" And I said, "Yes, please." And I interviewed and got that position. Worked there for two and a half years or so. Got laid off from there. It's just
the game industry.
yes.
I feel you. I'm sorry. Keep going.
Yeah,
It's
all right. Because I learned from my first experience. The things I reflected back on what I did wrong or what I could do better the first time around I got laid off, and how I can improve kind of my process to try to keep myself from having that prolonged period again, because that was really rough. I had to sell a bunch of stuff and it was not fun. So I was able to get another job a few months later, which was great. Very fortunate. And that was Kung Fu Factory, which was probably the job where I kicked into systems design the hardest and the fastest. Because when I joined Level 5, I had an interest in it, and I wanted to make sure that we made some money so we could keep our jobs, which is ironic. So I got into monetization design and started poking around trying to figure out, okay, how can we make some money while still keeping the game fun and keeping our audience? And when I got to Kung Fu Factory, they wanted me as an economy designer. So that is like 40 pages of spreadsheets, numbers, essentially being creative with numbers is probably the best way I can describe it. But it was very fast paced, and I think in the 2.5 years I was there, I was on at least 3 different projects, like from pre-production to 2 of them got released, 1 of them got canceled because of COVID. But it was a lot in a short period of time, and they did pretty well. And I was given a lot of opportunity to explore different roles, and I had a little team, and we did the live ops for NBA Ball Stars, and we hit our KPIs and did really, really well, which was awesome. And then I decided to leave Kung Fu Factory and try something a little bit different, because live ops is fun, but it can be also incredibly stressful.
Yeah.
And it was doing exactly that for me. And so I wanted to take a little bit of a break, kind of recenter myself and take it, I don't want to say take it easy, but just have a little bit of change of pace. So I got a job at Skydance, and I've been there ever since, working on Behemoth, which has been considerably less stressful. Very nice. I really like my job.
The culture at different studios is like so dramatically different. there's a real. I feel like it is usually like one of two things. It's either like hectic and insane and everybody's kind of doing everything, or it's like super calm and maybe even a little bit boring, but like comforting. And there's very little in between. At least that's been my experience. I'm definitely yeah.
Reflecting back on it, that sounds almost exactly like mine, because level 5 was pretty chill.
Yeah.
Kung Fu Factory was pretty chaotic. Jumpstart was pretty chaotic, and Skydance is pretty chill.
I think I tend to prefer the chaos myself, but my sleep schedule and personal well-being maybe disagree with that. I don't know.
See,
that's just the fun.
Yeah, when I was younger, I preferred the chaos.
Mm-hmm.
I had it when I was in my early 20s. I had it in my mind. I was like, oh, this is going to be easy. I can stay up for days and make games really quickly, and it's no big deal, guys. It's fine. And now I'm well into my 30s, and I've got a kid, and I'm already not sleeping as it is.
Yeah.
It wears on you after a while, and you start to really appreciate that calm, in a sense, that not having to stress about things quite as much, because you've got plenty of other things to stress about. Unpredictable babies and children.
It's very true. I look forward to getting there one day. I feel like I'm starting to make that transition right now. I still enjoy the chaos, but part of me says perhaps it's time to move on. But let's talk about some of what you've talked about here, and then get into the episode for the day. So I want to call out, I think, first thing for the audience, one of the things I find most interesting about your story is the fact that you essentially had to break in twice. Most people either haven't yet broken in, or they've broken in once, and despite some periods of layoff, are a little bit more stable. I myself have been laid off twice, but both times got a job again within 6 months. I think 6 months was my longest. And so that feels a little less like I literally exited the game industry and came back in. But you self-described that you exited and came back in, and I think working a government job for over a year, we could agree that's kind of the way. I'm curious how you now feel having had the chance to step out and step back in. I'm curious how you now feel as a game designer. Is this 100% for you? Is this where you will be forever on? Or are you a little bit more flexible and, it's kind of okay wherever life takes you?
So I have a preference would be to stay in games. I genuinely enjoy games a lot. I think it's the problem with going out of games and coming back to games is games take so much. Like whenever I talk to people about education in particular, it's like, well, you literally need to know everything. Like there's nothing that you can learn that's not valuable or useful in games. I mean, level design, architecture, systems design. I'm doing Excel spreadsheets. Like, come on, that's some Excel spreadsheet statistics and occasionally other disgusting math terms.
Is your childhood self like, dang it, they were right, I do use this now?
Yeah, that's the funny thing, because like I didn't think I would. But it just so happened this particular industry, there's nothing, like everything you can possibly learn can be useful in some capacity within game design. That's I think what's so fascinating. One of the things that's so fascinating about game design in particular, makes it almost addictive in a sense, is it demands so much of you, and you have to know so much to even do it. And, I mean, you have to know even more if you're doing an indie game.
Yeah.
Because you have to do your marketing, you have to do all the business stuff and stuff that I don't have to deal with if I'm not doing indie. I did indie for a couple of years. Mm-hmm. It was hard. It is. It's really tough. It's a lot of respect for indie devs.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's a big part of the appeal for me. I think I'd like to stay. If you never know what's going to happen with this industry. It's especially in the last year, it's been absolutely bananas. Mm-hmm. If something does happen, I probably would bounce out for another year or two and then come back again because they can't get rid of me.
Well, I love that. I think the confidence of it is really comforting. I know that I at least, I've heard this from a few other guests. I know that I at least went through a phase where I thought that games were actually maybe the wrong choice, despite having. I sold my first game when I was quite young, and realized therefore, it was potentially a viable career path. And despite having that experience, I still, during college especially, was uncertain if I wanted to be in games. At this point, no doubt in my mind, I'll be here till I die. But I know that plenty of our listeners have that curiosity as well. Is games right for me? And I think it's okay to ask that question. Is maybe something I want to say, and it's okay for games not to be for you. We actually, at the Indie Game Academy, we've long described that we have two types of students. We have students who want to work professionally in games, and that the reason that they're here is to try to gain experience to break into a job that exists. And we have students who are here because they want to learn to make their own studio. And those two kind of commingle. Oftentimes, one serves the other. But the third type of student that we're only just realizing exists and is okay, and this is fine for anybody here, is the hobby gamist, the hobby game developer, who doesn't really want either of those things, and they just want to build games now and then for fun. And that is a viable path for all of you. But I want to get to the topic of the day. So you are, first of all, a systems designer, which I would love to talk about a little bit because it is a bit of a black box in terms of game design. It's one of the ones that people understand the least on the surface. But you also brought up the topic for today's episode of why do we continue to play games beyond the campaign? And when we say campaign, because I was a little confused, what we mean is the single player campaign, essentially, when you finish the game, air quotes, and yet you keep playing. So I'd love to get that intro from you, Scott. Like, tell me why you felt that would be an interesting subject, and then bring us in.
So due to my experience at KFF and Skydance, I'm very data heavy as far as design goes. So I'm always looking for ways to explain concepts and analyze concepts. So analyzing things in games, like better, so I can better understand and I can better explain to people what makes your game fun? Like, how can I measure how fun my game is? Is there some way for me to tell that this game is going to be enjoyable? Because when you ask a lot of game designers, oftentimes we just say, oh, it's just fun. Like, we don't have like a good scientific test we can almost throw up against something and explain why it's fun. And so I stumbled across, I don't know how maybe if you teach us in any of your classes, but self-determination theory. And I started thinking about it a lot and thinking about how it applies to games, and particularly a lot of the games that I've been playing. And I've found it actually to be a pretty good metric to check against, to verify against, to kind of think about, oh, this game is going to be fun, not just for me, but for other people as well. And so if you haven't heard about self-determination theory, it's pretty much made up of 3 different needs. And the more you fulfill these 3 needs, the more fun, the more your players will enjoy your game and want to play more. So the first need is competence. So this is also known as mastery. So this is the feeling of you are doing well while being sufficiently challenged and progressing. So this is things like progress bars, quest logs, scores going up. Something like cookie clicker is a prime example. You're just watching progress go up. In a lot of RPGs, leveling up falls into this category. It's like people, oftentimes when they're making progress through games, this is the particular need that they're fulfilling that feels really, really good. The second need is autonomy. So the player needs to make meaningful choices that impact either their character or the story or the game in general. So fortunately, in the last year, we had a fantastic game that came out that is amazing at showing off autonomy, and that's Baldur's Gate 3, where what you say and what you do in the game legitimately matters. I'm not going to go into spoilers, but the levels that Lauren went through and make sure the player can access, there's so much depth to the decisions. Once you realize how deep it goes, for the goblin camp alone, early on in the game, there's a goblin camp, And you can approach it by just going in and killing all the goblins. In most games, that would be, you just go in and kill the goblins.
Yeah,
but there's also and that's the game. But you can talk your way in there. When I played it, there was a goblin that was captured, and I released that goblin. We snuck her out of the captured camp, and she snuck us in, and then I assassinated the bosses of the goblins. And so there's a bunch of different ways to do this encounter that makes it feel really exciting and fun. I think Baldur's Gate's a particularly good example of the second need, autonomy. And the final need is relatedness. So this is a feeling of being important and validated by other people. So this could be NPCs or actual other players. So something like Animal Crossing actually fits really well into this. If you've given other animals a gift, they'll thank you for the gift, and they'll be very excited. This is exactly what I wanted. I'll display it in my home. And oftentimes when you go to their house, they have your little picture or the fish you gave them displayed. And that helps the player to feel really good and really appreciate the game and enjoy it more. And so the more you fulfill these three needs, the more players are going to enjoy your game. That's pretty much it in a nutshell.
I love that. I haven't used self-determination theory as like a framework for design. I think it's a really strong one, partly because I think that there's like a tendency in humanity, I guess, to oversimplify things. We want to bubble things down to lists. It's why like the BuzzFeed's articles where it's like the 10 tips for whatever work so well. But I think there's real value to that. I think one of the services I provide on this podcast, for instance, is trying to take people's thoughts and boil them down. You have conveniently already provided us a really simple framework. I'm curious. I think one of the big questions in my mind about this theory is, do these three things apply to all players? So are we always thinking about autonomy? Or when we're building Baldur's Gate 3, are we only thinking about autonomy and we're thinking less about relatedness and competence? Are we always thinking about all three to some degree? How does, do we want all three of those things in every game?
So I think it depends, because something like Cookie Clicker, for example, really only focuses on one. You're not having much relatedness or autonomy in that game. It's primarily just competence. So I don't think you need to have all three to have a successful game. I think it helps. It definitely helps.
Yeah, I suspected that would be the answer. I think also it's the type of player and it's the type of game. So a Cookie Clicker is excellent at giving us some sense of progression, which is essentially competence in this framework. But terrible at giving us any sense. I mean, I guess there's some autonomy. So like buying things, but ultimately there's a hell of a lot less autonomy than most other games. And then relatedness, it definitely doesn't do as much, except for like when you're talking to other people about playing the game. So I suspect that these three are sort of, as with many things in our lives at this point, they're each a scale, and different players and different types of games are going to fall at a different point along those scale. But I would put forth that I think all games have some level of all three of these things, and that these are the things that get us excited about playing games in general.
Couldn't have said it better.
Nice. I'm glad you agree. Let's talk about systems design for a second. I think I want to get back to like getting somebody to continue to play a game post-campaign. But before then, I want to talk about systems design because it is a thing. It is an area that a lot of people care about. I guess before anything else, let's define it. What is a systems designer? What do you do as a systems designer?
That was very difficult because my particular position, I am very fluid and just do whatever's needed. Typically, I think what we're associated with is we do a lot of. Well, I put them into two camps probably. You got meta systems and you have core systems. They're a little bit different. So meta systems designers are the guys that are doing things like battle passes, anything that's progression related that's not related to the core game. So live ops events, those kinds of things. Core systems designers focus much more on the gameplay, and so that gets into a little bit of a gray area. because somebody like a combat designer, right? They're not technically, I think, a systems designer, but it's the second you start working with combat balance and trying to balance out those damage values and stamina burns and those kinds of things, that falls into the systems designer realm, where you're working in spreadsheets and numbers and trying to figure out, what's going to be the best player experience. So it's a little bit tricky to define, because I feel like there's a lot of gray area, but it's pretty much, you can focus down on, well, if they're not a narrative designer, they're not a level designer, they're probably a systems designer. It's anything number related, anything gameplay related, probably falls into their purview.
Yeah, it seems to me, in my experience, I tend to work in a lot of more indie studios. In my experience, at least, they're all commingled to some degree. When you say game designer, that often means more gameplay facing and less meta systems. It sounds to me like maybe a way for players to, a way for listeners to think about it. Tell me if you agree with this. Is more of the meta layer. You're also doing gameplay. Everybody is commingling a bit. Game development is multidisciplinary and collaborative, but your larger area of ownership is that meta system layer. Is that right?
Yeah, meta systems and game balance. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. So give us maybe like some exercises, practices, or actual like bodies of work that you do that maybe somebody could practice with, experiment with, to understand system design a little bit better.
Give me a second to think on that one. That's a really good question. Exercise. Well, some of this, let's see here. The two that come to mind the quickest for me would be, one of them would be around balancing, actually probably there's three that come quickly. Trying to figure out how progression would function, let's say you had something like Royal Match. Royal Match is pretty well known. How much XP you're going to get per levels, how much progression, what is the experience you want players to have, what are the emotions you want them to feel, what kind of power-ups they're going to have, and trying to plan that out for just 10 levels, so you can try to understand essentially the player's story through the gameplay and through their progression in those levels. Second, I would probably think, I don't know how do I explain this without going into like a long paragraph about economy design.
Long paragraphs are great sometimes.
Yeah.
Whatever you got.
So let's balance. I'm trying to figure out, let's say you have 5 different characters, trying to figure out what each of their roles are going to be and how they interact with a specific enemy set. I think would be a fun exercise. It's a lot of actually what I do these days.
So when you say characters, are you talking about like NPCs? Or are you talking about PCs? What do you mean by characters?
Let's say player character. Let's say you have like a party. Let's say Final Fantasy VII. You have Final Fantasy game. You've got a party of like 4 or 5 characters. Each of them fulfill some kind of a role. You've got your tank. You've got your healer. You've got your damage, your glass cannon. How do they interact with your generic enemy? What are you? How do they interact with the enemies? How do the enemies interact with them? Do they each fulfill their role? What is their job? And to what extent do they do their job? These are a lot of the things that I actually have to think about these days.
Nice. Interesting. Awesome. Okay. And did you say you had a third? You want to add on one more?
I did, but it's kind of a hybrid of the two, so I don't think it's as strong. It just muddies the water a little bit.
Yeah, I think I like what you're saying. I think I tend to be more of a generalist. I'm a game designer as opposed to any particular field. I would say if I had to fall into one, probably lean into gameplay and/or systems. I'm definitely not a dedicated systems designer, so I'm grateful to get a little experience here from you. I do think splitting things up by level is a great, simple way for people to think about it and to start to experiment with it. Because ultimately, yeah, I feel like 50% of the system designer job is being in an Excel spreadsheet and trying to quantify how different resources or activities flow through the game. And so just breaking up your game into multiple levels, even if it isn't level based, by the way, even when you're making, like, let's say an endless runner, you can still split that up by level. They're just invisible levels. And quantifying those levels, I think, is a great way to get started. And then I think the second part, just kind of interesting. I would call that maybe more of just a general game design practice, thinking about having multiple characters in a party and how each of them perform and how they relate to the world. I love those as 2 exercises, so listeners, give them a shot. I'm going to ask you one more question. I think we're going to get to community questions. The topic of today is meant to be, how do we continue getting our players to play even after they've finished the regular campaign, the core story of the game, the core campaign of the game. I'm curious what your intro is there. We've talked about the self-determination theory. We've talked about some of the ways that we get people to play in general. But what are some of the aspects or your recommendations for how to keep somebody playing past finishing the core content of the game?
Well, the strongest, the self-determination theory, the more you fulfill those 3 roles, like something like Baldur's Gate, which does a fantastic job at fulfilling those 3 roles, you'll notice players are playing multiple times over and over again beyond the campaign. And so that kind of takes care of that in a sense.
So all you got to do is spend 5 years building so much content that nobody could ever fully finish it.
Only 5 years.
Yeah.
Plenty of it.
I actually don't know. Is that how long? Yeah, how long was the dev cycle on BG3?
I think they were in... I think they had like 2 or 3 years, then they went into Steam Greenlight or something like that. And then they had another like 2-3 years off after that, refining it and just making it the absolute masterpiece that it is now.
Yeah, it says 6 years. Yeah. Yeah, if you want to make BG3, it only takes a couple hundred people and 6 years.
Only. Piece of cake.
Yeah. Okay, so it's a bit about, it sounds like just having the content there, having some reason to continue to play. Do you have any other thoughts on continuing post-campaign?
I mean, there's tricks you can do, little systems that you can build that'll help to retain players. Things like battle passes and season passes and seasons in general, just rotating content. But if your core game isn't very strong to begin with, that's why you'll see, like, Call of Duty is Warzone's one of the kings probably of like FPS right now. There's not much of an argument, I think, there. But they rotate their content every 3 months or so. New battle pass, new game balance, new this, new that, new characters. And as long as you keep having, if you have a strong core gameplay and you keep having stuff for players new things for players to unlock and to do, then they're going to keep playing unless you don't respect their time, which is a whole nother balancing issue.
We'll have a second episode about that.
Yeah, that I can talk about that particular topic for a long time, because there are certain games that I have spent years in raiding every single week with a group of friends, but after a few balance passes, they've changed it so it's so difficult that it doesn't feel like it respects my time, and it just takes when I'm having to grind for 8 hours a day. I have 4 or 5 days a week, like a full-time job essentially, just so that I can access the end game content and do the raids. That's not fun anymore. That's too much.
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely an interesting balance to be had. There was the whole drama that happened with the new Battlefront game, the new Star Wars Battlefront game, where you can, air quotes, unlock Darth Vader by just playing, but somebody did the math and it would take you literally 1,000 in-game hours. Or you can spend it was like $40 or something, if I remember right, to get the character via cash. So I do think it is worth mentioning, respect your players. And you can only monetize so far before you become one of the bad guys. And, don't do that, please. That said, yeah. I do think, something perhaps for everybody to understand. A lot of people who listen to this have yet to work in games. the majority of games that you work on, the majority of your professional career is going to be working on some form of live ops, where you are continuing to deliver content to a game that already exists rather than building something from the ground up. And it sounds to me like that's a lot of what you're talking about. As long as you continue to deliver content, if you have already nailed the core game, if you have already created a fun and engaging core game, then you can essentially continue to deliver content, ad infinitum. Of course, at some point, people will get bored.
Yep.
But that is so much of game dev at this point in time, in the meta of game development. It's just like, how do I get people to keep playing this because it's already fun? So let's continue to have fun.
Yeah, if you want to take a good look at a game that's been around, I mean, Fortnite's they've been around doing this for so long that I think was either last season or one of the fairly recent seasons. They've been around this so long that they turned back the clock for a season, and a bunch of players came back.
Yeah. Yeah, World of Warcraft, actually, the perfect example of that. They went back to they literally went back to the original version. They went I think they just called it Legacy, World of Warcraft Legacy or something like that. Or Vanilla? I don't remember. They went back to the original form of World of Warcraft, released that as a side release. You can still play the modern version or you can play the old version. And then they started releasing the exact same DLC, sometimes changed in ways they wish they would have changed it. So it's like there's like a multiverse now of World of Warcraft, where we have two alternate competing timelines, and it works. Players want it; they like it.
Oh, that I do not envy Blizzard's live ops team. That sounds like a colossal keeping two World WoW games like functioning and with live updates it sounds like just a colossal amount of work. That sounds tough, man.
I agree. It is kind of cool, though. I mean, I love it as an example, as a case study. All right, I have kept enough of your time. I've been enjoying talking about this, but let's get some community questions in. So I've just called Rick up on stage. Like I told you, Rick has lots of questions, and they're always good ones. So Rick, would you like to kick us off with the first community question?
Yes, Scott. So as a systems designer, I'm curious. You work in spreadsheets, but they're not always the best way to convey the information to your teammates. Like they have to build out a system. What do they need to do? What does your documentation look like that you find is most effective in communicating the systems that you intend to your teammates?
This is actually a fantastic question. Something I've spent the last year really thinking about. Is when you do this, I'm sure you guys are aware, when you talk to different disciplines within game dev, they all think differently. Artists are much more visual, whereas engineers, they're much more analytical, and so you have to create documentation that works for each of them. So my documentation is almost like a hybrid of the two ideas. So I'll have an image. I'll use a lot of GIFs if possible, whenever I can, to try to help reinforce an idea. Flowcharts if I'm trying to explain a system, how it goes step by step through. Let's say a progression. If I have like some kind of character progression, they have abilities. I'll use like a flow chart just to have that displayed, because artists love to save that to the computer and reference it, and they always send it back to me at some point in time and be like, hey, but you said this. Like, yes I did, but we're changing it. And then for engineers, I use a lot of bullet points, as brief as possible, because A, they don't have any time, and B, that's just how they work really well through that. I wish I could show you a picture of my documentation, because it's very pretty, and it's a lot easier to explain. But
if anybody's not under NDA, send it our way and we'll distribute it. I think I feel like I've come to understand in my professional career how much of game design is just explaining to other people your design. Like that is like 30 to 40% of your job. It's just fielding what you think will be cool and trying to get people to actually agree on what it means.
Explaining what you're working on or what your design is, what its purpose is, and then trying to defend it as they try to pick it apart.
Yeah.
And also providing them with that persistent resource that they can reference after the conversation's over.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that's not just like
tricky things.
Yeah, and not just like defending it, because blanketly defending it is wrong. I think that means you're a weaker designer, in my opinion. It's defending it, but also somehow simultaneously leaving the possibility of it being wrong and you adapting based upon the
Maybe
feedback you're getting from the team.
adapting's a good maybe negotiation's a better way to put it, because
Yeah,
it's
okay.
defending does imply that I'm right, you're wrong, and it's not always that's not always the case.
Yeah.
But when you can all look at the same thing, then you're looking at something concrete and you're not basing your ideas on interpretation of what was said. Everyone's looking at the same thing, and it's that baseline for you to have the conversation around.
Very true. But I have had meetings where people in the past, not particularly recently, where we've all looked at the exact same thing. We've all gotten something entirely different from it.
The
So
wonder
it's
of the human
really,
mind.
yeah, it's being as clear as humanly possible. I think what's the example I used is when you, like, let's say you're describing to somebody, oh, it'll be like Zelda.
Mm.
And so, like, I might think it's like Breath of the Wild, but the engineer who's 20 years older than me might think it's like Link to the Past, and then an entirely different engineer or artist might think it's like Wind Waker. And so those are three very different Zelda games. And so it's having that clarity is a skill that you develop after making so many of these documentations and having negotiations with people over tweaks.
Amazing. All right, I'm going to read the next question for Justin because I'm not hearing back from them. And you pretty much already answered it, so feel free to give a shorter version of the answer, or whatever you feel is right. But I think it's worth asking more deliberately. Justin just asks, what is the difference between a systems designer and other forms of design? What is the distinguishing factor there?
How can I put this briefly? So level design plays with blocks, for lack of a better term. Like they literally physically put blocks in world and put to lay out the actual world. Narrative, it's, at least in my experience, it's like being a DM for D&D. If you've ever done that, you're
like that.
planning out the story. You're kind of guiding the player along through with items, and you're not necessarily trying to kill them. You're just trying to make sure they have a good time and they're engaged with the story. Systems design, very gray because it dabbles into a little bit of everything. But typically, if you're dealing with numbers, it's probably systems design. It's fairly safe to say. So anything game balance, economy balance, sometimes combat a little bit can be considered systems, but typically combat these days, I'm seeing a lot more combat designers. Yeah, they're becoming their own thing. I mean, there's even camera designers now. They're becoming their own thing. People just focus on a specific camera angles. And if you look at I think Respawn has some positions where they have camera designers. I'm like, that's a whole new genre. I mean, when I started, we didn't even have technical designers.
Yeah.
And now we have technical designers, which is a whole new field. And it's a lot of specifications. So it's really difficult to narrow it down anymore, because systems feels much more like all encompassing of a lot of these different groups. But yeah, pretty much the safe bet is if it's involving numbers, it's probably systems design.
I like that as a safe bet. Namaste Geek asks, to extend the question, a follow-up question. I'm curious how you'll answer this. So does that mean it's like full stack for programming?
No.
That's probably how I'd answer.
Yes.
So why is it not?
I think I see what he's getting at. Or I think I see what they're getting at.
Yeah.
Kind of. That's because full stack, you're doing back end, you're doing front end.
Yeah.
So systems design, you're doing back end, which is a lot of the balance numbers. Some things you don't even see depending on the game. Like, for example, in Zelda, Breath of the Wild, they probably have numbers for how much damage each sword does when you actually hit somebody, and that's not things you think about when you actually hit them. You just kind of know. So that's a little more on the back end, I guess, and then front end would be more
gameplay
numbers. Yeah.
I
guess in Borderlands the numbers are much more in your face.
Yeah, I can kind of see what you're getting at as well, Namaste. Like, you are, I guess, touching front end and back end, and maybe that is the part where they're similar. But I think full stack actually implies like generalization. Like, I do a little bit of all of it, and I think that is the opposite of systems design. I think systems design is a little bit more specialized, probably closer to full stack on as far as designers go, would be just a general game designer who really does
Yeah,
do a bit
I
of
agree.
everything. Yeah. Awesome. Rick, do you want to ask another one of your questions? Your pick.
Yeah, sure. So I have a question about you're talking about getting players to play beyond the story. What is a great example and the context in that example of how you got a player to self-assign them a goal, or to assign themselves a goal within the game that was not an explicit goal of the game that the designer set out to do, but you kind of encourage them to continue playing because they now want to do X.
There's one of those moments where I wish I could talk about my current project. Because there's a lot of more subtle stuff in this particular project than there was in some of my previous ones. Let me think here. How did I get a player to self-assign themselves a goal? I mean, it's something as simple as like a battle pass in a sense. Like they want this particular item, right? They're assigning themselves that goal. They're picking the battle pass. They're assigning themselves, okay, I want that item. I'm going to go hunt for that item. I'm going to grind for that particular item. So it could be as simple as that in some instances. In other instances, you can do it via story campaign. Like let's say somebody has a character they're particularly fond of. They've spent 50 hours with this character, and they're like their companion character in the game. And all of a sudden, a particular alien race kills this character off. Your player is very likely now to hate that alien race and want to go hunting for them. This is also what happened to me in Starfield, actually. My motivations completely shifted from, I'm enjoying myself to, I am going to end these aliens because they killed my wife and I'm very angry. So it comes in different forms, and you can tackle it actually. I think the Starfield example was handled more narratively in a sense, because it wasn't done through gameplay. It was done in over the course of a couple missions, and you had the decision of whether or not you wanted to go try to save them or save all the work that you two have been working on for hours and hours and hours. In my case, I decided to save the work because that's what I thought she wanted, and then she died. But yes, there's different ways to do it, and this is where I get a lot into the systems design. Is a little bit of a gray area because that particular instance leans a little bit more into the narrative, whereas the Battle Pass instance leans a little bit more into like meta systems.
Very interesting.
Cool, thank you.
Awesome. All right, I think we're coming to the end, but I think it's time for the question of the day, where we reiterate one of the most important points that we learned from Scott to help us all remember it. So get your fingers on the keyboard. The first person to correctly type out the answer to this question gets 3 House Cup points for the house of your choice. Yes, we have houses. It's undemarcated magical wizarding school up in here. The question of the day is, what are the 3 needs of self-determination theory? It's posted in chat, so Mark typed out a bunch of stuff to hope they got it. Namaste nails it. Well done, Namaste Geek. Let us know which house you'd like to give the points to. Ranger, Rogue, excuse me, what am I saying? Ranger, wait, no, I was right. Ranger, Rogue, Warrior, or Cleric. The correct answer was competence, autonomy, and relatedness. Oh, Mark did actually type that out. You know what? I'll give you both points. Mark just shotgun approached, and it worked.
I like Mark's approach. He just covered all the bases.
Everything you learned in one episode. Listeners, you can't see this, but Mark wrote like 4 paragraphs of stuff, just hoping that he would accidentally cover the correct thing. Amazing. All right, I'm going to call Namaste actually up on stage for the final question of the day. Namaste, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. Thank you. This has been really interesting, and now I realize I need to learn more about games design versus systems design, so thank you for that. When I first saw this topic, I looked at this like, okay, what games do I go back to? Well, ones that I have DLC for, or ones that I still have a boatload of side quests for. So mainly I play RPGs, obviously. But I was wondering, for any type of game, what your thoughts are on, like say I'm setting up a game and I haven't done even one yet, so I'm very early. What's the thought process of, does something make a better DLC, or is it better as like side quests?
As far as just the content of the game,
Yeah,
or
mainly.
how it fits into the self-determination theory.
Either way, I would be happy to hear on either point.
So the content in the game, the DLC is oftentimes what we wanted to do. At least in my experience, it's what we wanted to do, but we just did not have enough time or budget to get through, because the game has to ship. It has to ship on this date. We want to have this extra 3 levels. We want to have this extra character class. It would be really cool, but we just don't have the manpower or the resources. So let's add that into a DLC, or add it as a character in an event later, maybe in a battle pass or something. It's hard to say exactly what should be DLC versus what should be in the core game. And I think it varies based from game to game. Because if you don't have enough content in your core game, then players get bored, they get frustrated, they don't stick around for your DLC. And then if you have too much, then you probably stressed yourself out and didn't give yourself enough time to take care of yourself and burn yourself out, which is very bad. So I think a rule of thumb is to try to understand what your MVP is as far as your shipping. So what do I need? I need 4 character classes, let's say. Otherwise, it won't be enough decisions for the players to be particularly interesting. I need this many levels. Otherwise, this is our complete. Let's say you plan for 8 levels, but you understand, okay, I need at least 5. Because without 5, the game is just not long enough for the players to have that full experience. I can't, explain this narrative well enough. It just too much is missing. And trying to figure that out. Once you've kind of got that figured out, it's easier to split out. Okay, this content isn't 100% necessary for us to ship, so this can become DLC versus content that's really important for the core game.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah, I would echo that a little bit. I in my experience, it actually happens pretty organically, and is not often something that's really planned out ahead of time per se. Eventually, it is, but I think for a large part of production, at least the first half, it's unclear exactly what's going to go into the MVP, and then as you get closer to release, you start going, yeah, there's no time to add that. We'll consider adding it later as a DLC. And then there's also just a reality of, is the core game good enough? And that's a question that I think you never stop asking. And eventually you go, okay, now we've reached a point where this is good enough. We're finally ready for launch. And then at that point, you're going to do a feature cutoff, and anything else past that is DLC or some other form of live ops. At least that's my experience with it.
That was actually something else I was, I'll be done. I was wondering, when does this come in? As somebody who was trying to even conceptualize my first game yet, should I be thinking about these things now? And it sounds kind of like this kind of comes down the road.
Yeah, there are many different ways to project manage, and some people have very clear, very strict definition of what the game is very early on. In my experience, my personal preference, which understand I am one designer in a massive industry. There's a million different ways to approach things. In my experience, you have a firm plan, but you're always willing to change it. So you'll set a plan. You'll say, this is what's going in the game. But then 3 months later, and multiple times throughout that 3 months, you'll continually be like, is that plan quite right? So you will have a plan, and you will have a strict plan, and you will agree on that super early. So, in week 1, or maybe not that early, but within a couple of weeks of confirming you're going to work on this game, you'll probably say, here are the features that are going into the game, and these are some of the ideas for DLC later. But the definition of those two categories are probably going to change multiple times throughout production.
Yeah, I think it is a common misconception for people outside of the industry, thinking that designers planned for this content not to be in in the main game and it's in the DLC, but it's typically, like you said, it's very organic.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. All right, so we're at the end of the episode. I have one kind of funny question to read for somebody, which, where did it go? Yes, Alec. Alec asks, have you played the game Oxygen Not Included, and do you think the systems designer had a fun time making that game?
I have not played Oxygen Not Included, but I think I've seen it, and I would imagine most systems designers that I've met have an absolute blast making the games we're working on. Because at a certain point, you have such a deep understanding of the game that you can do some like, oh god, I can't wait till Behemoth comes out. There's some crazy things. Sorry, I'm just very excited about our particular game. But yes, he probably had a lot of fun. He or she probably had a lot of fun.
Yeah. Yeah, I think in general the answer is yes. We're in the game industry. Like, some of our jobs suck, yes, and get repetitive, yes. I've had to do a bunch of like object audits recently at my day job, meaning I go through every single object in the game. That's been a little tedious, and it's not been the most fun. But like most of the time, we're having fun. You know, we're working on stuff that we really enjoy. There's always a mix. It's still a job. There are days where you'll be like, oh, this sucks. I don't want to do this anymore. But I think for the most part, if somebody has self-selected to be a systems designer, they're probably having a blast poisoning little characters and having them die of no oxygen, you know?
You get to be a troll. It's every once in a while. Just wait until you have a build that your producer needs to play, and you changed an enemy to be just absolutely terrifying, and he's just so confident because he's played the build so many times, and he has no idea what's coming for him. It's so satisfying.
I love that. There's like a couple, I think this is probably under NDA, so I can't tell you exactly what it is, but there's a couple like random debates we have on our team at Paradox about like what should be in the game and what shouldn't. There's been multiple of those things that I've just put in the game and like not approved by anybody. And don't do that. You have to have a pretty particular kind of team for that to be okay. But it is a blast to have my general manager who said no to something find the thing in the game anyway, and then usually he laughs and agrees it's hilarious. Anyway, we're at the end of the episode. Before we say goodbye, Scott, we'd like to give you a second here. Is there anything that you'd like to promote or any last words of wisdom you'd like to give to the listeners?
Words of wisdom. It's a tough road, but it's worthwhile, and you're going to do great. There's been multiple times in my particular experience where I thought I was down and out and finished, but I was not. And if I can survive this, then anybody can.
Yeah.
I guess promotion. I have a newsletter.
Nice.
I have a game design newsletter that I publish every 2 weeks. There's a link to it on my LinkedIn, and I publish a lot of little systems design carousels and tidbits regularly that people enjoy. It's not Substack or Medium. It's actually Beehive. I didn't want to go with Substack or Medium because they spam my readers pretty heavily, and I didn't want to spam people, ideally. So I have Beehive instead. But there's a link on my LinkedIn if you pop in there, you'll see it.
ScottFineGameDesign.com?
That's my portfolio. It's there too.
Okay.
It's my newsletter is called Signposted. It's a little play on the signposting concept from game design.
Awesome. All right, I'm going to drop the link, and we will put that link down below. So if anyone's listening and wants to learn more about systems design from Scott, please check it out and subscribe. I have one last thing to ask of you, Scott, which is, do you have a homework assignment that the listeners can partake in the next week or so? Something that'll just take them, an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, where they can practice some of what we've talked about here today and learn a little bit more.
That is a very good question. Only an hour is the tricky part.
I mean, you can give them something bigger. It's just, life.
Something small. If you play like a match 3, like a free to play match 3 game, just think about, get maybe 30-40 minutes into the game, so you're past the fatui and you're into the actual core game itself, and think about what how the different power-ups might affect this if you just had it, because some match 3 games, they're more liberal with power-ups. They give you power-ups for free, and some of them are very stingy with them, and they make you pay for them. So just think about how that affects the actual gameplay and how that affects the player's experience. It's probably the most 1 hour manageable
I like that
thing.
All right, so your homework is to go play a match 3, to write down the different power-ups you see in the game. Perhaps use some of the advice that Scott gave us earlier, where you split it by level a little bit. So when are those power-ups available? When do they get dropped? When are you given them versus when do you have to pay for them? And make yourself a little doc on how the game gives you power-ups, whether paid or unpaid. And then, if you do that homework, we'd love to see it. We'd love to comment on it. We'd love to celebrate you for doing it. So tag us on LinkedIn. We'll comment, maybe reshare you. And you can also come into our Discord and share it there if you want to be a little bit more private about it. All right, that's going to be it. Scott, thank you so much for your time. This has been a fantastic episode. You have a very, chill voice. I feel like I could listen to you read me an audiobook, and it would be great.
I appreciate it.
Definitely. All right. And thank you, everybody, for being here and asking your wonderful questions. Listeners, thank you for listening. As always, if you enjoyed this episode, we ask that you send it along to just one other person who is someone who is curious about systems design or about continuing gameplay after the campaign or about anything we talked about that you feel could use this episode. And would you please send this link along to them for us? All right. That's going to be it. We'll be back here again, 12 p.m. Eastern Time, Wednesday. Come join us for the next one. There are links down below. Thank you, everybody, and we'll see you next time. Adios.